Hello friends, greetings to all watching the video. I welcome you all to another episode of Convo with Apricus. Friends, our topic of discussion today is international covenants on the right to housing, its prospects in India and in other countries. And to throw light on this topic, we have Dr. Shalini Rohilla Panigrahi with us. She is Assistant General Manager Law in HUDCO, Housing and Urban Development Corporation, New Delhi, India. Welcome, ma'am. Welcome to Convo with Apricus. We will start the discussion now.
Okay. First, let me share the screen. I have made a small presentation on right to housing. Let me share it. Okay. Hello, everyone. So our topic today for discussion is right to housing and what it in the light of various international conventions, what is Indian Constitution on right to housing, and various Supreme Court judgments have been analyzed, which will lay a very good impact on the right to housing and what are the current practices. So these international conventions, basically, they are the international law on housing rights. So there is no covenant as such, which is specifically on right to housing, but we have to derive that housing right from these conventions. So in this presentation, we will be discussing, having a brief introduction. Then we will talk about the international conventions, various international conventions which are referring to right to housing. As we know that India and South Africa, these two countries have a major development in this area. So we'll be discussing the development in these two countries. The very important judgment which came out from India is Olga Tellis, which laid the law of the land also. So Supreme Court made some various good points in this judgment, which led to the basic of right to housing. Then South Africa, on the other hand, in the Grootboom judgment, also made some very important, it's a very important judgment from the right to housing perspective. Then there were various judgments which followed Olga Tellis. So it laid a precedent for various judgments. But on the other hand, there were some judgments which did not follow Olga Tellis' judgment. So we'll be discussing those judgments also in brief. Then finally, conclusions which we are deriving from these discussions and few suggestions which I have in my thesis of right to housing. I will discuss those suggestions here also. These are very relevant for the topic today.
Yes,
let's begin. As we know, when we hear this word housing, it reflects a very fundamental human need which everyone requires, apart from food and clothing. Because if we don't have a proper house, then we cannot expect other facilities to grow. We need that house along with other facilities. It's not just a roof overhead above it, but we require some basic infrastructure facilities like clean water, healthy environment, health, education, and the workplace, etc., should be very near to these housing conditions. So when we say right to housing, it's not an independent right. It is linked to various rights. So this discussion is very important from today's perspective. Housing, when we say housing, it has to be seen in the holistic and interdependent framework in terms of livelihood sources. What are the security aspects? Then personal safety, social and cultural settings. Ownership of the house provides a sense of stability and belongingness in a community and helps him or to create a physical, social and cultural identity. So basically, when we give a proper house to someone, it is important for its overall growth, like physical growth, social security, and culture. It identifies himself culturally also. So this right is very important and has to be discussed in today's scenario. It should be discussed because still we see billions of people living in the homeless conditions. Even in India, you can see whenever when we are moving around, we see so many people are homeless, and they are just making these pathways which are on the like road. They have made the house on the roads, so they are basically homeless people, which are not even given that basic facility of shelter. Even right to housing is far away. They are not even given that basic shelter. So housing is fundamentally important to the individual physical welfare as well as one's dignity and role in community. So this has to be discussed because it is related with so many aspects: health of children, families. When we talk about right of child, how can we expect to give right of child if we are not giving that right to housing? So it's an interlinked right, basically. We have seen that government across the world have developed these rights, but they are not developed in the national law. They are developed in international law, regional constitution, and national law, and various national laws. At the international level, housing rights instruments are adopted by almost all the states. We have seen international law like Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we'll be discussing in further course of time. In these international conventions, the right to housing has been referred, and so many countries, 150 countries around, they have signed to these international conventions. So they are party to the international conventions, and they have given their assent. So these rights should be respected and implemented. But as we know that international law is not binding. So that's why the countries are not taking it seriously. Now, legal status right to housing has to be studied through the various international conventions on human rights. These are most important declaration is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In 1948, this declaration was adopted by almost all the countries of the world. And the Article 25 of this convention is very relevant for right to housing, which says that everyone has right to the standard of living which is adequate to the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothes, housing. So the housing has been given reference here, and it's very important because it has been referred along with the food and clothing and medical care. So from here, the housing right has been recognized and signed by so many. This has been adopted in the General Assembly. So it is binding upon the so many countries, including India. Then another important convention is International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Article 17 of this convention says that it is not giving how to rising, but it says that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary or unlawful interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence. Everyone has 17.2 says that everyone has the right of protection of law against such interference. So it is not protecting that right to housing, but it is preventing the forced evictions. If suppose we are living in a house, and if someone is attacking that protection, if they are taking away our house or whatever, if they are forcefully evicting us, so this convention is protecting those unlawful acts on the right to housing. So it is protecting right to housing in a positive sense. Then International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, Article 11.1 is very important in this regard. It clearly reflects the structure and content of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So Article 25.1 of UDHR has to be read along with 11.1 of International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. These both provisions include housing along with food and clothing as aspects of right to adequate standard of living. So when we say that a person will get an adequate standard of living, they means that the proper housing along with food and clothing should be provided. So housing has been given a very important role. Discrete right has been derived from Article 11.1. So this is 11.1 is the key in right to housing. These two conventions have given the right to housing a discrete right concept. Then general comments of Committee of Economic Rights are very important in this regard because they define what exactly is adequate housing. They are giving so many parameters. Like right to housing is guaranteed if there is security of tenure. Housing is not adequate if there is no security of tenure. For example, when there is always a like threat that we will be evicted, we will be forced to leave this house, so that cannot be said right, that right to housing is adequate. So security of tenure is very important because it guarantees protection, legal protection against forced evictions, harassment, and other threats. Right to housing is has to be protected against the forced eviction because that is the biggest threat to right to housing. So General Comment 4 protects people from forcibly eviction. Second, housing is not adequate if the person are not given various services like infrastructure facility. So housing is connected with infrastructure. Then housing should be affordable. For example, if government is providing some schemes, but they are not giving affordable housing, they are pricing very high. So how will the common man afford that house? So it has to be affordable also. Then it should be habitable. It should not be in a dilapidated condition. The condition is the housing should be adequate and it should be protected against the cold, damp, heat, rain, wind, and other threats. So that is habitable. Housing is not adequate if it is not habitable. Then it should be accessible. It should be if it is not governing the specific needs of disadvantaged and marginalized group should be taken into account. So it should be accessible. It should not be far away from workplace, etc. So it has to be habitable. It has to be accessible. It has to be affordable. It should be protection from security of tenure. So all these are aspects of right to adequate housing. So this general comment number 4 is very important in this regard. I have given a link also, so you can go in detail in for this. Then location. Location is very important. For example, if the workplace is in Noida and you are giving a house in somewhere Ghaziabad, so can you say that housing is adequate? Can you say? No.
No, ma'am.
So location is very important. Okay.
Mhm.
Then culturally, it should be what culturally adequate means. If I am staying here and my relatives and all my community people are staying far away, can you say that it is a culturally adequate society? No. So there should be a scope of interaction with various individuals to make it culturally adequate. So these are the aspects which govern housing to be adequate. Now, when I'm summing up these instruments, I can say that these rights are not forcing the national governments, various governments of the world to give right to housing. But on the other hand, they have recognized, they have respected and protected these human rights to meet the minimum core obligations, to ensure discrimination and direct legislative measures, to make policies which are for the good governance, for the welfare of the people, for progressive realization. Then various other conventions like CEDAW, they have also referred to right to housing. I will not go in detail, but I am mentioning the important articles mentioned in these conventions, which are always, whenever you see that women, children, they have got special rights. Even in our constitution, Article 15.3 is specially talking about special rights for women. They can be made under that provision. Because why we need special rights for children and women? Because they have always been on the back seat. We have seen that they are always be on the back seat. So special rights have been made for children as well as women. You can see that like in metro, there are seats reserved. So they have been treated as a privileged class because they have always, in the past, they have suffered a lot. So the even Constitution of India is recognizing their rights. Then Declaration of Right to Child, as I just mentioned, that children and women need special protection. So the special covenants are there on these children and women. So this also Article 27 talks about housing. If the parents are not providing adequate housing to children, so we can say that they are deprived of their basic rights. So these conventions are recognizing right to housing. They are very important conventions. Then International Covenant on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination also talks of right to housing in Article 5.3. See, in this section also, it is prohibiting, it is putting an obligation on state to prohibit and eliminate racial discrimination. Why these conventions were important? Because we have seen so much racial discrimination in various countries. Not now, but in past, like in South Africa, we have seen so much racial discrimination there. So these conventions came up to protect the rights of the people who were discriminated. Then international covenants of migrant, because migrant workers have always suffered. They travel from one place to another. So they should be given the access to housing. If not proper housing, they should be given some form of housing facility when they travel from one place to another. We have seen in the COVID times that these migrant workers, they had to travel from one place to another. They were not given proper housing facility. They were living in slums. They used to make house anywhere, temporary houses. So it's a responsibility of the government to give that basic right to housing. Then we see refugees. Refugees have also suffered a lot. So these conventions talks about the refugees' right to housing. Now, besides these international conventions, there are so many declarations which talks about right to housing. Some of them are Declaration of Right to Child. It also talks about that the child should enjoy the benefits of social security, and for that he or she requires right to housing, which is giving proper housing, recreation, and medical facilities. So this puts an obligation again on the governments to provide right to housing. Then ILO recommendation number 115 talks about special housing programs to include measure like slum clearance. If you are clearing the slums for the sake of development, it's a duty of the government to make houses for those people who are displaced. Whenever we are talking about right, it comes with a duty. Right cannot be studied alone. We have seen in the jurisprudence aspect that whenever we have right, there is a duty it places a duty on the other side. Like here, the government is there is a duty on the government to provide right to housing. We have rights, so duty on the government. So this declaration is very important. Then Declaration on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Article 3.1 talks about prevention of providing of right to housing. Special effort should be made. So it is again putting an obligation on the state governments. Then ILO Convention number 169. It also puts a government have special responsibility to respect for their integrity. So these all includes right to housing as well. Not specifically, I have marked in these conventions and in my PPT wherever the housing is mentioned. So international ILO various conventions are talking about right to housing. They talks about ILO means labor. So labor should be given special rights, because whenever they are working, their working environment should provide them health, including sanitary facility, canteen should be there, and housing. If not proper housing, then temporary shelters. If they are working in some area like on a contract basis, so you should give them proper housing. I have just seen in my nearby some projects are going on, and the workers, you will not imagine, they are sleeping on the roads because they were not given proper housing facility. They were working day and night, and they were just forced to sleep on the road. So we need the intervention of government. Then Declaration on Social Progress and Developments. So this is again a very important convention which talks about adequate housing, the provision of all, particularly person of low income groups, because low income groups are suffering the most. They don't have that basic income to make housing. They don't have money to buy the housing. So here comes the duty of the government to make provisions for providing right to housing for these lower income groups especially. And we have seen in our country, the government has taken steps. You know that Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana and so many conventions, so many programs have come up, but still lot has to be done. Then this Declaration of Right to Development, it talks about overall development. Overall development can take place only when all the facilities like food, housing, education, and these facilities are provided. There should be equitable distribution. Our constitution even talks about equitable distribution of wealth. But we have seen that there is inequitable distribution. There's the gap between the rich and the poor is increasing day by day. At regional level, also right to housing is recognized, especially in Europe by way of European Social Charter, which talks about adequate standard of living. Article 331 is very important in this regard. It talks about prevention and reduction of homelessness. So this housing problem is universal. It is prevalent all over the world. But Europe and various countries have taken steps, and they are forcing the government to act. Then African Charter has also special provisions. But when I attended a recent conference in my organization only, there were so many representatives from African countries. They were saying, the condition in their country is very poor. The government has hold over the land. So the people are at the whims and fancies of the government. So condition is really bad in this right to housing, and lot has to be done. Lot of awareness has to be created. Then African Charter of Well-being of Child. When we talk of well-being of child, we have to talk it about housing. Because without house, how will the child prosper? Like, how will the child grow if the house is not giving that facilities to the child? Then besides these conventions and declarations, there are other conventions also on right to housing, which I have researched. And these are the conventions, like International Convention on Recommendation of Working Housing, then Declaration on the Rights of Disabled Person, UNESCO Declaration on all these conventions are, and various declaration, Agenda 21 are also referring right to housing as important right. When we say all these things, I have just summed up in 3 slides. That globally this right is recognized through various instruments we have seen. At international level, they derive a substance from the treaties. So many countries have signed these covenants. So at least it is binding on them, if not legally, then morally binding at least. Because whenever the countries are meeting, various like G20 and etc., so many meets are there, these issues are discussed. And it puts an obligation on the state to provide at least basic facilities to their to the citizens. Then international human rights recognized. But what about national laws? Our constitution is recognizing in the form of Article 21, but still the right to housing is not a fundamental right. Right to education is fundamental right, but right to housing is still to be achieved. So that is why I researched and I did my PhD also on this. Millions around the world live in life or health-threatening conditions, overcrowded slums. If you have seen those slums, you will not be able to see those slums. So just imagine how the people are living there. Millions are forcibly evicted. Even if they are sitting in these slums, they have always the threat of being forcibly evicted on the gauge of this development. Government will say that we are developing this area, we are making mall, so they will forcibly evict without providing that accommodation also. In India, there are increase in population and poverty has got housing short. People are moving from village to cities for the employment, but these cities are not providing them basic minimum facilities. So they are forced to develop slums. Slums have become like norm of the cities. So these slums were now notified under the state governments were forced to make the Slum Act and notify these slums. Now these slums are recognized by the government, and they are even providing housing also when the slums are evicted. More often than not, evictees of such slums are not relocated. This is the biggest problem they are facing, that they are just evicted. You go anywhere. The government is not taking any responsibility. So they are from the house which they have made, whatever the house it was, they are forced to be homeless. They include, in the slums we have seen, old person are also living, orphans are living, widows, single mothers. So India is like working in this area. India has made some commendable progress, but yet lot has to be done. Acute shortage of affordable housing. Government is still to act on this. They have to create affordable housing. They have to create that partnership between public and private. So legal basis in the Indian aspect has been derived from Constitution. Our Constitution is firmly grounded on principle of liberty, fraternity, equality, and justice. And especially these articles 14, 15, 3, I referred earlier also. Article 21 is very important in this regard, because whenever it refers to right to life, it has referred to right to livelihood. It has associated with that. A very important judgment in this regard is Olga Tellis. Till 1970, the Supreme Court was silent, but after this judgment, Olga Tellis, things have changed. This judgment is very important because here the rights of payment dwellers who were staying in these slums they were forcefully evicted. Matlab they had to leave that area. But then one of the person, he filed a public interest litigation on behalf of so many hutments. So Supreme Court took a very positive stand, and it said, though the act was not illegal, by which they had to be evicted, but they said that unless and until these people are given alternative accommodation, you cannot throw them out. And you will be amazed to listen that these people are still sitting there because they have not been provided alternative accommodation by the government. So this was the first judgment of the sort, and major expansion of Article 21 was seen in this case. So after these judgments, many positive judgments came, which recognize right to housing. In this judgment, a very important line is there: the eviction of payment of slum dweller not only means his removal from the house, but destruction of that house itself. Because that small piece of house was everything for him. So if you're destructing that, it is like, and the destruction of that dwelling house is the end of all that one holds dear in life. So Article 21 provides that person cannot be deprived of life by procedure established by law. So this Article 21 was recognized, and it included right to livelihood. So you can say that right to housing was, in a way, recognized in this important judgment. Then in South Africa, a very important judgment, Grootboom judgment, it recognized the right to housing, and Section 26 of the Constitution of South Africa was referred here, which says that everyone has right to access to adequate housing. The state must take, the state has been given a responsibility to take legislative and other measures. So here the state was forced to act. There was a positive obligation on the state. No one can be evicted from the house except by the order of the court. So this judgment holds a very important impact on Indian courts also. So this judgment has been referred in so many Indian judgments. So these are the important judgments which came after Olga Tellis, which recognized right to housing, like Shanti Sir Builder versus Narayan K. Kotame. Chameli Singh is very important case. So all these judgments are recognizing right to housing. And you will be like, it's very important to understand that obligations which were laid in UDHR and ICSR, which we have discussed in the international conventions, are referred here. They were the courts have given the reference of these important conventions and held that it is a duty of the state to provide and protect the citizens from being forcibly evicted. But there were, when we were seeing so many positive things, there were some judgments which were regressing Olga Tellis principle, like Narmada Bachao Andolan. In this, whatever it was said that whatever has been achieved so far, this judgment brought everything back to the, like, it showed a highly disregard for housing rights. The people were forcibly evicted in the guise of, like, construction of Sardar Sarovar project dam. They were forcefully displaced without giving adequate resettlement and rehabilitation plans. Following these judgments on the right to housing and shelter, Justice Ramaswamy had laid a very important principle. He considered the obligations under UDH and ICSR and upheld right to shelter, especially for the weaker sections. So these are putting positive obligation on the state. In various recent also, the courts have said you build right to shelter, at least shelter for the homeless. So at least right to housing is recognized now. But still we are fighting for that right to housing as a fundamental right. It should be a fundamental right. Again, this judgment I have referred here. Then various judgments which came after Olga Tellis, like consumer education. Then UP Awas, these also recognize right to shelter. Then State of Karnataka versus Narasimha Murthy also says that Supreme Court has laid down that positive obligation on the state to fulfill right to shelter housing. So by the Supreme Court, by way of various judgments, have recognized right to housing. Because if our legislature is not working, our judiciary is working in this regard. So whatever Supreme Court is saying, that is also law. In Chameli Singh, the right to housing was recognized. In Shanti Sir, we have already discussed. Then very recent judgment of PUCL, the issue of homelessness was considered as a violation of human rights. And Supreme Court brought the intervention of special commissioners. It ordered that shelter must be provided to meet the homeless. So this put an again positive obligation on the state. So here the courts are forcing the government to act. Then thereafter, government is taking now, so many policies are coming in. But still that right to housing is still to achieve that important right. Okay. Then Tukaram case. These are the various conclusions which I have derived from the discussions. Housing is a basic human right. Lack of house is an insult to dignity for those who have been denied. Then Planning Commission of India, when we have seen these 5-year plans, many 5-year plans have given right to housing important role. Like certain minimum standard of housing should be there in fifth 5-year plan. It was referred. Housing is not a commodity. It is a like safe, sanitary, houseable condition, which was also referred in general comments, which I have defined. Then these are like repetition only, but I'm summing up. General comment number 4, various international conventions, Supreme Court judgments, all have says that all are saying, all are moving in that path. Then after the Supreme Court judgments, even the government, like legislature came into act, and it made various laws which pave path for making housing a fundamental rights, like Recognition of Forest Act, human rights which cover, then RERA, which we have discussed in previous presentations, right to fair and compensation. This is very important because if you are taking the land of someone, you are giving compensation. If you are taking the land, you are giving compensation. So this act recognizes that. Then Street Vendors Act are there. If you are removing them, you are giving them proper compensation at least. Then RERA, we have already discussed that this act came in 2016 to protect the right of home buyers. Because if we have invested in a house and if we are not getting the possession, this right is appropriate. This act protects the right of those home buyers by punishing the builders. Protection of human rights. Again, when we are talking about human rights, we are talking about basic rights. And basic rights cannot be granted unless and until they are giving proper housing facilities. So some suggestions which came up from my thesis are, we need reforms in rental laws because we can't give everyone a house, or like we can't give everyone the ownership of the house. So government should come up with the schemes of rental housing. It should come up with a strong plan of rental housing. At least like from of income, some part is taken and you properly rent that and make the good laws, rental laws, which are very beneficial for this low income group at least, so that they get a proper space to live. And if they can't buy house, at least they are give you affordable renting house. Again, rental housing should be given a lot of importance. Land use should be like optimized. There are so much lands which are lying vacant, which belong to the government, PSUs. So much lands are lying vacant. So government should take out some schemes to use these vacant squatters of the PSUs, defense, for providing basic facilities to the poor. Like they should release these surplus land for making right to house, making housing at a very nominal prices. And land pool should be there. Land pool scheme should be promoted where owners of the lands are exchanging their lands for like whatever compensation they require. So they can be given cash investments, and they give land instead of that. So these lands can be used to provide adequate housing to all the segments of the needy people. Then there should be judicial adjustment of floor area ratio. So that has to be taken care of while providing additional space for housing. So thank you for listening to me on right to housing.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for throwing light on right to housing in such a lucid manner. Indeed, housing is one of the basic needs which an individual need, along with food and clothing. And government should take steps regarding making housing a legal right also. We should provide
it's legal right, but it's not a fundamental right. So they should act towards fundamental right at least. They should take steps towards making it fundamental right, if not giving proper right.
Yes, ma'am. And I hope the audience will get benefited by listening, by seeing the video and listening to you. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.